Hello, everyone. Uh, Welcome to week 4. The purpose of this video today, everybody, is to further understand characterization in Aliens and Tender. There is no new story for this week, so we're going to review the techniques that we've looked at to gain a real solid understanding of how authors present characters in stories. So the goal today with this video, everybody, before the end, is to examine the main characters in Aliens and Tender a little further, and specifically examine how techniques are used to present these characters. Remember, everyone, when we meet people in the real world, there are instinctive abilities that humans have to understand, trust, fear other people. In stories, all we have is the text. We don't have our senses other than just our abilities to interpret the symbols and words on a page. So the ways that authors reveal characters and stories is through language, of course, and these techniques are functions of language. So that's what we want to look at today. What are these techniques, and how do we identify them in these two stories? So first, everyone, what are we talking about? Well, characterization is the way that authors present characters, as we've mentioned several times before. Now, this is broken up into two major buckets, everyone. There is direct characterization and what's known as indirect characterization. Now, direct characterization is what you would expect of a text. If I want to tell you about someone, I will directly characterize them. So this is what we often think of as characterization, of course, when we describe someone as gentle or quiet, like Jimmy in Aliens. That's direct characterization. That's the author or the narrator telling us about the other character and using descriptors and modifiers. But there's also indirect characterization, of course. And if you think about how we know other people, this begins to make more sense in the text. Because if I just write about what someone did in action, if I present something they said, dialogue, if I, as an author, write interior thoughts that they have, private thoughts, this is a monologue, and this gives me access to their true feelings. If I can examine in a story how people are treated by others through relationships, this also gives me a great window into understanding these kinds of ideas. So let's look at these techniques a little more specifically, everyone. Specifically, we're going to look at indirect techniques because this is largely how characters are understood in stories. Just to pause on that for a second, everyone. Remember that what we're doing here, literary analysis, is all about interpretation. We looked at this briefly in week 2. We're going to talk about it throughout the semester. But the indirect techniques that authors use, dialogue, actions, relationships, for example, inner monologues, these are areas where the reader has to interpret or make interpretations. So, for example, if I read dialogue from a character, that dialogue is not going to slap me in the face and tell me about who this person is. I have to infer certain things from it. So let's look at these techniques, everyone, to begin with. The first is something that we're fairly familiar with, first-person narration. Now, both stories are first-person narrations, okay? The story of Aliens and Tender are both told from one of the characters, Chandra in Aliens and Eden in the story of Tender. And if you think about first-person narration, everybody, it's an excellent place to begin with to talk about techniques, because if I tell you a story directly, that's my perspective, okay? And so that means that if it comes from one person's perspective, that means that that person has vulnerabilities, understandings, things that they believe are true, predictions about the future, certain emotions. So they tell the story from their perspective. And this raises issues of things like reliability. Can we trust what they say? It also reveals certain things that they can't know, for example, because if it's a first-person perspective, I can't tell you what someone else is thinking. I can't tell you what happened when I wasn't in the room, for example. So that first-person perspective is very limiting, and both of these stories have that element to it. Okay, so it is something to understand from the beginning. Next, everyone, the idea of repetition and direct description. This is one technique that's used in Aliens to reveal the character of Jimmy. Repetition being that words like never and always are used as qualifiers to talk about what Jimmy does. Certain descriptions are used directly to characterize who Jimmy is: quiet, gentle, mysterious. So we start to see at the beginning Jimmy is someone who exists in the background of the story, but he might have a certain amount of hidden depth to him. Okay, because the techniques don't reveal a whole lot of richness at this point. Next, everyone, the idea of actions in the stories. Both stories use action to develop the characters. Jimmy is seen in his actions at the beginning of the story to be someone who's an outsider, reclusive. He's last in line, never to the front. He avoids attention. But then towards the end, his actions show him to be far more forthright and honest and reliable. Maybe even someone who is very trusting in the way that he treats Chandra after her date and the way that he reacts towards her. We see him through these actions. In the case of Eden, her actions reveal more about what she wants and her desires and her sense of identity. For example, when she cuts off the braids, a very symbolic action. This is something that she does in order to try to take control of her own identity. She wants to reject that scene and the braids that were given to her. She wants to take ownership over this. So actions reveal often what characters don't say directly. Which brings us to dialogue, the things that characters do say directly. So dialogue, everyone, of course, the things that people say, they reveal a lot about us. They talk about our upbringing, our status, our power relationships, the way that we handle emotional pressure, perhaps, the relationships that we hold. Dialogue also reveals certain elements around what we don't say if we submit to other people, for example. Okay? Maybe who is the person who leads in a situation? Do people withhold information? People are evasive, they're blunt. Speech patterns tell us a lot about a person's character. Okay? So we need to pay attention to these moments of dialogue. For example, Jimmy is seen as someone who is quite gentle, hesitant even. He's caring. The scene inside of the hardware store where he's initially helping Chandra, or when he comes back from the date with her and he treats her with certain care and talks about the preparation and wants to keep her safe. These are things that reveal Jimmy to be a very upstanding person. Whereas in Tender, the dialogue from Eden presents more of a person who is emotionally unstable and, at least, and as the title suggests, very tender in the way that she works towards others. So dialogue can often reveal functional elements of relationships, everybody. And this is a very important thing to remember. Which of course brings us to relationships. Now the relationships in both stories are very revealing. Jimmy's relationship with Chandra, of course, but also Eden's relationship with Fatima. And these are the two relationships that you will study if you want to examine the characters more in the story. So Jimmy is seen through the narrator, the aunt of Chandra, to be someone in the beginning who's mysterious and quiet, but towards the end he's seen as very caring, very sort of stable and hardworking, even someone who cares about his community, someone with a very long view for things. And we see this through the relationship with Chandra. With Eden, it's the relationship with her best friend. And this relationship is fairly unstable. Eden's relationship, her sense of identity especially, is defined by the relationship she has with her friend. And this is seen especially through the final scene when they discuss their relationship inside of the Subway restaurant. Finally, everyone, interior thoughts. Well, not finally, we got symbolism too, but interior thoughts are this. First, this doesn't exist in the story Aliens, because the story Aliens, of course, is told from the perspective of the aunt of Chandra, not Jimmy. So we don't have access to any of Jimmy's inner thoughts. We have to understand him through the way that others characterize him, or the way that he speaks, or the way that he treats other people through actions and relationships, of course. But in the story of Tender, we do have access to the interior thoughts of Eden. And this gives us a real sense of who she is, a deep insecurity with her identity. She's willing to almost change the things that she says and does sometimes to please other people. Okay? And we see this through her interior thoughts. Finally, everyone, this was the final one. Symbolism is present in this story, of course, through Aliens, through the scarf and Tender, but I don't want to cover it too much right now in the beginning. We're going to cover symbolism entirely in a whole unit later in the course. And symbolism has some deeper elements to it that discusses with the theme and the message of the author. So for the moment, it's enough to just understand that it's there, and it's a way of understanding character more deeply as well. Okay? So the character of Jimmy in Aliens, everyone, as we see, we learn that he isn't just a quiet person. He is a home that's very carefully prepared. We find this after the date. He values his community and the history therein. And he has this deep sense of spiritual awareness. And we learn this through actions, behavior, dialogue. Okay. So the story of Jimmy and Aliens, Van Camp uses techniques like repetition, behavior, and that community perspective to really develop the character of Jimmy. He goes from someone who's seen as a little bit invisible to someone with a real hidden importance and a depth to him. The story of Tender reveals Eden to be someone who is far more emotional. For example, in the very beginning, when she says, "My best friend doesn't like me very much." The ideas of reliability, of trying to gain emotional understanding from others. This is present in this sort of idea. Her identity is framed by other people. The techniques that are used, like physical sensations, Eden is constantly referring to her tender-headedness. Tender is a physical aspect and an emotional aspect too, so that's where the word kind of comes from. We have access to Eden's inner thoughts, the ways that she refers to the things that she perhaps really wants for herself, and pay attention to those moments. Or the symbolic actions of cutting off her hair and saying, "All better." This is a moment when she wants to recapture that identity. So these techniques are a little different than the story Aliens, everyone. Because Charlene Bazile in the story Tender uses voice, emotion, sensation, this symbolic action, sort of things that require more interpretation in order to understand the character of Eden. So this week, everyone, when you're producing reading response 2, and that's the goal this week, everybody, think about not just understanding Eden, but trying to feel the character. How does she feel in those situations based on dialogue and actions? Why does she do the things that she does? And this will help us understand her more deeply. Okay? So good luck with reading response 2, everybody, this week. And I will produce a video later on in the week offering more thoughts as we go along through the materials. Thank you very much, everybody. Use the chat box, use the email address I've given you if you have any questions. Have a good day.